First they killed my father. A daughter's tale of survival in Cambodia. Hook. Trapped in a deadly game of survival, a daughter fights to remember the father they took from her. Can she escape the nightmare, or is it already too late? Watch till the end for a twist you won't see coming. The sun was a dull red, hanging low in the sky. The air felt thick, sticky with heat. I stood frozen, eyes wide, heart thudding in my chest. In the distance, the sound of boots on dry earth. Slow, steady, unrelenting. The soldiers came closer. I could smell the dust on their skin, their sweat mingling with the thick, choking air. My hands trembled at my sides. "Don't move," I whispered to myself. I couldn't breathe. Every step they took brought the terror closer. Behind me, I could hear the soft rustle of my mother's breath. She was trying to be silent, but the fear it was impossible to hide. The soldiers were only a few feet away now. I could see the grim faces beneath their wide-brimmed hats, their eyes empty, cold. Suddenly, one of them turned and met my gaze. I couldn't look away. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't move. The world felt still, like everything had paused. His eyes narrowed. I held my breath. "Move," he barked. I didn't know who he was talking to. It didn't matter. My mother's hand gripped mine tightly, her fingers cold. She pulled me away, dragging me towards the woods. The ground was uneven, the sharp grass cutting into my feet. I barely felt it. My mind was somewhere else, somewhere far away. My heart raced, drowning out the sounds around me. The only thing I could hear was the pounding of my pulse in my ears. I could feel the sweat running down my face. A branch snapped behind us. I froze. The soldiers had seen us. We weren't going to make it. I turned, desperate to find a place to hide. But the shadows were closing in. The woods felt alive, pressing in on all sides. I didn't want to die. I didn't want to lose anyone else. Then I heard it. A voice, low and terrifying. "Don't run." My body seized, but I didn't dare move. I couldn't. They were so close now. Closer than I had ever feared. I wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. I wanted to beg for mercy, but there was no mercy. And then silence. The kind of silence that fills the air with dread. The silence before the storm. I took a deep breath, praying it wasn't too late. And then a sound, a scream, but not mine. It came from somewhere far away. The scream echoed through the trees. It was a sharp, raw sound, filled with pain. A mother's cry. I turned, unable to stop myself. But my mother pulled me harder, dragging me forward. "Keep moving," she whispered urgently. My feet stumbled over the uneven ground. The woods seemed endless now, like they were closing in. The trees crowded together, casting long, dark shadows that swallowed everything. I couldn't stop thinking about the scream. It echoed in my mind. I wanted to know who it was, where it came from. But the soldiers, they were still behind us. I could feel them closing in, their presence like a weight pressing down on my chest. We rounded a bend, and there was a clearing ahead, a small, desolate patch of earth. I wanted to run, to hide, but there was nowhere to go. The sound of footsteps grew louder, closer. I turned to look back. Too late. A soldier appeared at the edge of the clearing. His face was hard, unreadable. I froze, heart pounding. "Stop!" he shouted. His voice was low, dangerous. I held my breath, the world narrowing to that single moment. The soldier's hand rested on his weapon. My eyes darted to my mother. Her face was pale, her mouth tight with fear. She whispered something in Khmer, a prayer, maybe. The soldier stepped forward. Closer now. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. My pulse raced faster, each beat like thunder in my ears. I felt like I was drowning. Suddenly, a noise behind us. A rustle in the brush. Another soldier appeared, blocking our way. We were trapped. I could see the barrel of his gun now, gleaming under the dying light. My breath hitched, but then a loud crack, a burst of movement. A shadow rushed forward. It was too fast to see clearly, but it knocked the soldier off balance. The air was filled with the sound of shouting, fighting. The world seemed to explode into chaos. I stood, paralyzed, watching. But my mother yanked my arm, pulling me into motion. We ran without thinking, our feet pounding against the earth, the branches scraping our skin. The noise behind us grew, shouting, screaming, gunfire. I didn't know if we were going to make it. I couldn't think of anything except the sound of our footsteps and the fear that gnawed at my bones. We didn't stop until we reached the river. My breath was ragged, my legs like lead, but we couldn't rest. Not yet. The river was dark, its waters swirling quietly in the dimming light. It looked peaceful, but I knew better. The current was strong, merciless. We knelt by the water, breathless, trying to listen for any sign of movement behind us. The woods were silent now, but that didn't mean they were gone. My mother's hand trembled on my shoulder. She whispered, "We have to cross." Quickly, I looked at the river. It was deep, too deep to wade through without being swept away. But there was no choice. We couldn't go back. The sound of boots in the distance. The soldiers were getting closer again. My heart thudded in my chest as my mother looked at the water, calculating. There was a raft, half submerged near the bank. I could see it barely above the surface. "Help me," she said urgently. I nodded, the fear paralyzing my hands as I pulled the raft towards us. The river's current tugged at it, but I managed to steady it for a moment. My mother stepped onto the raft first, her eyes scanning the dark water ahead. Then she reached out a hand to me. I hesitated. The sound of the soldiers grew louder. My fingers touched the rough surface of the raft, and I climbed on quickly. We pushed off, the raft drifting slowly at first, caught by the current. The moonlight flickered off the water's surface, casting strange shadows. It was eerily quiet now, only the sound of the water against the raft. I couldn't look back. I could feel the chill of the river soaking through my clothes. The cold reached deep into my bones. I gripped the edge of the raft, eyes fixed ahead, but my mind kept racing back to that scream, to the soldiers. Had they caught someone else? Had they? The raft lurched, pulling me from my thoughts. A sharp crack sounded behind us. The thudding of boots on the riverbank. The soldiers were there. I could hear them shouting, their voices harsh, angry. We had to go faster. The current was pulling us downstream, dragging us farther from safety. But the soldiers weren't giving up. I could hear them splashing into the water behind us. Closer now. "Row," my mother cried. I grabbed the paddle, feeling its cold surface under my hands. I tried to steer, but the current was too strong. We were being pulled deeper into the dark. Suddenly, there was a splash beside us. A soldier's hand shot up from the water, grasping for the raft. I screamed, panic surging through me. "Row, mother, row!" My mother shoved the paddle into the water with all her strength. But the soldier's grip was unrelenting. The raft tilted dangerously. For a moment, I thought we were going to capsize, and then another splash. The soldier let go. I didn't know if he had drowned or if he was still chasing us. I didn't want to look. We kept rowing, desperate, faster and faster. But the night was swallowing us whole. The water seemed endless, a black void that stretched into the unknown. The raft lurched again, but this time it wasn't from the soldiers. The current had taken full control. I struggled to keep the paddle steady, but my arms were burning. My breath came in sharp, shallow gasps. My mother was beside me, silent now. Her face was pale, a mask of exhaustion. The darkness around us felt suffocating. The trees on the banks had disappeared, swallowed by the night. The only sound was the water rushing past us. I tried to keep my eyes on the faint moon above, but it was fading, hidden behind thick clouds. The air was cold, biting, making my skin prickle. The river twisted, weaving like a snake. I couldn't tell if we were going in circles or if we were truly escaping. It didn't matter. I had lost all sense of time. I only knew the pain in my hands, the ache in my legs, and the deep fear gnawing at my heart. Then something changed. The river's current seemed to slow. I glanced up. Ahead of us, there was a shape, a shadow in the distance, rising from the water. A small island. I didn't know if it was a safe place, but it was our only hope. "Mother, look," I whispered. Her eyes followed my gaze. She nodded, and together, we paddled toward it, our movements slow but determined. As we neared the shore, the raft scraped against the rocks. We both leapt off, stumbling into the shallow water. I could hear our breathing now, ragged and heavy, but we had made it, for the moment at least. I turned back toward the river, straining to hear any sounds. The soldiers weren't there. The darkness around us was thick, but for a brief moment, it felt like we were alone, hidden. I collapsed onto the damp earth, my heart still racing, my body trembling. My mother knelt beside me. Her hands were cold, but she touched my face gently, brushing my hair back. "We have to keep moving," she whispered. Her voice was steady, but I could hear the fear beneath it. I nodded, though I didn't know where we would go next. The island was small, barely enough for us to rest. The trees surrounding it were dense, their branches thick and twisted, but it was a place to breathe, a place to survive for now, and that's all that mattered. I closed my eyes, the weight of everything crashing down on me. The scream, the soldiers, the flight. I didn't know what would happen tomorrow, but tonight I had my mother, and we had made it this far. The night was colder than I had imagined. The air around us seemed to close in, thick with silence. We sat close together, my mother and I, sharing what little warmth we had left. I could hear the sound of water lapping against the shore. It was a constant reminder of the world outside, dangerous, unpredictable. My mother's eyes never left the trees. She kept glancing over her shoulder, always on alert. I lay down beside her, trying to block out the fear clawing at my chest. But the thoughts wouldn't stop. Had the soldiers passed us by? Had they given up the chase? I couldn't be sure. The night was too quiet, too still. The island felt like a fragile bubble, suspended in time. I closed my eyes, hoping for rest, but every rustle of leaves made me jump. And then I heard it, a sound, faint at first, barely a whisper. Footsteps. I held my breath. The sound was distant, but it was there. I turned to my mother, but her eyes were wide with fear. She shook her head slowly, her lips pressed tightly together. We had to move. I rose to my feet, my legs unsteady beneath me. The water was still cold, but I didn't care. I needed to get away. My mother stood, too, her hand gripping mine. We didn't speak. There was no time for words. We slipped into the shadows of the trees, keeping low, moving as quietly as we could. Every step felt like it might betray us, but we had no choice. The footsteps grew louder, closer. I didn't dare look back. We reached the other side of the island, where the trees were thicker, the underbrush dense. It offered some cover, but not much. I could hear the soldiers now, their voices, harsh and angry, cutting through the quiet. I pressed my hand to my mouth to stifle the breath that threatened to escape. My mother's grip tightened. I could feel the tremble in her fingers. There was no way to outrun them. We had no weapons, no defense. But we couldn't stay here. A crack of a branch. A soldier's voice calling out. I froze. They were here. I turned to my mother. Her face was pale, but her eyes were full of something else. A fierce determination. She pulled me deeper into the trees. We had no time to think, only to move. We ran, our feet barely touching the ground. The soldiers were close now. I could hear them too clearly, their voices rising in anger. Then a shout, a curse. My heart skipped a beat. They had seen us. The shout echoed through the trees, jagged and raw. My heart thudded in my chest. They had spotted us. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear the thundering footsteps of soldiers crashing through the underbrush. My mother pulled me forward, faster now. We darted between the trees, stumbling over roots, barely keeping our footing. The sound of boots grew louder, closer. I could feel the heat of the pursuit, the sweat stinging my eyes. Don't stop. My mother's voice was urgent, barely a whisper. But my legs were heavy, my body protesting, and still we ran. We reached the edge of the island, where the trees thinned out. Beyond the trees, the river spread wide, a dark expanse of water. We were trapped. I looked over at my mother. Her face was grim, her breath ragged, but her eyes were still filled with fire. There, she said, pointing to a cluster of rocks. I didn't understand at first, but then I saw it, a narrow gap between the rocks, just wide enough for us to squeeze through, a hiding place. We ran toward it, our feet barely making a sound. I could hear the soldiers now, just on the other side of the trees. Their voices were raised, shouting orders. My heart raced faster. We reached the rocks and ducked inside the small gap. The space was tight, barely enough for both of us to fit. I pressed myself into the cold stone, trying to make myself as small as possible. My mother squeezed beside me, her hand tight on my wrist. The world outside felt like it had frozen in place. The voices of the soldiers grew louder, but then silence. I didn't dare breathe. I could hear them moving, their heavy steps grinding the earth beneath their boots. The air between us and them was thick with tension. I closed my eyes, trying to hold back the terror rising in my throat. We were so close. One wrong move, one sound, and they would find us. The minutes stretched on, every second feeling like an eternity. And then, finally, the footsteps began to fade. At first, I couldn't believe it. I strained to hear, my body tense. But yes, the soldiers were moving away. I couldn't make sense of it. Why had they stopped? I waited. A few more seconds. Nothing. I breathed out, my chest heavy with relief. But we couldn't stay here forever. We had to leave. We couldn't let our guard down. My mother gave me a brief, tight nod. It was time to move again, though we slowly emerged from our hiding place, the rocks scraping against my skin as we shifted. I didn't dare make a sound. The air felt colder now, the forest unnervingly silent. My mother led the way, her steps slow but steady, her eyes scanning the darkness. I followed her, my heart pounding in my chest, each beat like a drum that threatened to give us away. The soldiers were gone, but the fear still clung to us. We moved cautiously, slipping between trees, our bodies low to the ground. Every rustling leaf, every snap of a twig felt like it could betray us. The deeper we went into the forest, the more isolated we became. There was no sign of life, no sound of the world, just the cold, the dark, and the endless stretch of trees. I didn't know how much longer we could keep running. The uncertainty gnawed at my mind. But we couldn't stop. Not yet. We reached the edge of the forest, and ahead of us lay a vast field, open and exposed. I stopped, my eyes scanning the open space. It was dangerous to cross, but we had no choice. "We have to make it to the other side," my mother whispered, her voice tight. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. We stepped into the field, moving quickly, the grass crunching beneath our feet. The moonlight barely touched the ground here, and the field felt like a vast expanse of nothingness. But then, a distant shout broke the silence. I froze. The sound of boots again. My stomach lurched and my breath caught. They had found us. I looked at my mother. Her eyes were wide, her face pale. We had no cover, no shelter. We had to move. I grabbed her hand, and we started running again, faster this time. The soldiers' shouts grew louder, closer. I could hear the crackling of branches, the pounding of feet chasing us. The field stretched endlessly before us. No end in sight. I felt like we were running toward nothing, toward the edge of the world. I dared not look back. We had to make it across. The sound of our breathing filled my ears, drowning out everything else. Then a loud shout, a voice too close. I risked a glance over my shoulder. A soldier. He was running toward us, his rifle raised. I could see the anger in his eyes. We were too far out in the open. There was no way to escape him now. The soldier was gaining on us, his steps quick, relentless. I could see his face now, twisted in anger, his rifle aimed directly at us. My heart pounded harder. We had nowhere to go. My mother's grip on my hand tightened, her face set in determination. "We're not going to make it," I whispered, panic rising in my chest. But she didn't say anything. She just pulled me forward, faster. My legs were on fire, but I couldn't stop. The soldier was almost there. I could hear his breath, heavy with exertion. Then something changed. A loud crack, a gunshot. My body jerked, instinctively ducking, but it wasn't us. I didn't know what happened at first. I dared not look back, but I could hear the soldier's footsteps faltering, then slowing. A gasp, a cry of pain, the sound of him stumbling. My mother didn't slow down. We kept running, our feet moving as if our lives depended on it, because they did. I could hear nothing now except the pounding of my heart and the rush of air in my lungs. But then another voice, closer this time. It was familiar. A shout, a name, my name. I froze. My mother did too. I turned slowly, fear crawling up my spine. It couldn't be, but it was. There, standing in the moonlight at the edge of the field, was someone I knew, a figure, tall and strong. It was my brother. I couldn't believe my eyes. How had he found us? "Run!" he shouted, his voice urgent. My mother didn't hesitate. We darted toward him, my legs moving faster than I thought possible. The sound of the soldiers was still there, but it was fading now. We were almost there. I could see my brother's face clearly now, his eyes wide with concern, but full of something else too, a hope. He pulled us close as we reached him, his arms wrapping around us both. "We have to go now," he said, his voice low, filled with urgency. But there was no time to ask questions. We had made it this far, but there was still so much more to survive. The soldiers were still out there, and they would come for us again, though we didn't waste another second. My brother turned without hesitation, leading us toward a narrow path through the trees. The woods felt alive, full of shadows that shifted with every step we took. The moon was almost completely obscured now, leaving us in near total darkness. My brother moved swiftly, silently, like he knew the way, like he'd been here before. I didn't ask how. I didn't dare. I just followed, my heart still hammering in my chest. Behind us, the distant sound of voices still echoed, but it seemed farther now, as if they were losing us. For a moment, I thought maybe, just maybe, we had a chance. But we couldn't stop. We couldn't rest. The forest stretched on, the trees pressing in, the branches reaching like twisted hands. I felt the weight of my mother's hand on mine, cold and trembling. We were all running now, my brother in the lead, my mother and I following closely. The path narrowed, and the air grew thick with the scent of earth and wet leaves. I stumbled over a root, but my brother caught me before I could fall. "Stay close," he said. His voice was calm, but there was an edge of fear beneath it. We weren't safe yet, and the worst part, I wasn't sure we ever would be. The sound of the soldiers, now much closer, pushed the air from my lungs. I thought I could hear their voices again, growing stronger. They were closer than I wanted to believe, but we couldn't stop. We didn't dare stop. My brother led us off the path suddenly, ducking into a thicket of trees. The underbrush was thick here, and the ground was uneven. I gasped for breath, trying to keep up, but the fear, the exhaustion, it was too much. We had run so far. I thought about the soldier, the gunshot, the distant voices of the others. They were still out there, waiting. "We have to hide," my brother whispered urgently, pulling us deeper into the thicket. It was a small space, surrounded by thick bushes and low branches. We crouched down, trying to make ourselves as invisible as possible. I pressed my back against the cold earth, listening to the sound of my own breath, sharp and uneven. And then there was silence, the kind of silence that felt unnatural. I held my breath. The sounds of the soldiers seemed to disappear entirely. Had they stopped? Were they near? I didn't know, but every part of me screamed to stay hidden. My mother, her face pale, gripped my arm tightly. I could feel her trembling, though I didn't know if it was from fear or from the cold. But we couldn't stay here forever. I glanced at my brother, his face tense, his eyes scanning the dark woods around us. He nodded once, signaling that it was time to move again. My heart sank, but I knew he was right. We couldn't afford to stay still. The soldiers weren't far behind. And this time, there would be no escaping. That we rose from the underbrush, as quietly as we could, the silence pressing heavily on us. My brother moved first, slipping through the trees, his figure barely a shadow against the darkness. I followed, my legs aching with exhaustion, my feet stumbling on the uneven ground. Behind me, I could feel my mother, her breath still ragged, but determined to keep up. We had no time to think, no time to plan. We were running on instinct now. The deeper we went into the woods, the darker it became. The trees closed in, their branches like skeletal arms reaching for us. I could barely see the path anymore, only the dim shapes of trees and bushes. I thought I heard something behind us, a snap of a branch, a voice, but my brother didn't slow down. "Keep moving," he whispered harshly, his voice low but urgent. I nodded, barely able to hear him over the pounding of my heart. We moved faster, my breath coming in short, desperate bursts. The sound of our footsteps was too loud in the stillness, but I couldn't help it. Every moment felt like we were running out of time. I glanced over my shoulder. The shadows seemed to stretch forever, but I couldn't see anything. Still, the fear gnawed at me. We had to get to safety. But where was safety? We couldn't outrun them forever. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we reached the edge of a clearing. It wasn't much, but there was a small abandoned hut in the center, half hidden by the trees. My brother signaled for us to stop. We crouched low, trying to stay out of sight. The hut was a temporary refuge at best, but it was all we had. My brother moved first, creeping toward it with the careful steps of someone who had learned how to survive in the wild. I followed closely, my heart pounding louder with each step. As we neared the hut, my brother motioned for us to enter. We slipped inside quickly, the door creaking softly as we shut it behind us. Inside, it was dark, with only the faintest light coming through cracks in the walls. There was no furniture, no sign of life, only dust and decay. But it was shelter. For the moment, it was enough. We huddled together in the corner, my mother's arms around me, her body trembling, though I couldn't tell if it was from fear or cold. My brother stood near the door, listening intently. The silence in the hut was suffocating, and my mind raced. What would happen next? Could we really escape? Would the soldiers find us? I wanted to ask my brother, but the look on his face told me he didn't have the answers either. The air inside the hut felt thick, heavy with the weight of our fear. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to steady my breath, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone, that something was out there, waiting for us. The silence stretched on, suffocating, as I tried to steady my breathing. I pressed my back against the cold wall, feeling the roughness of the wood against my skin. My mother's grip on me tightened, but she didn't speak. I could hear her breathing, soft, shallow, as if she were holding herself together by sheer will. My brother remained by the door, his eyes scanning the cracks in the walls, alert, waiting. We were trapped in this dark, decaying hut, and the world outside felt like an endless storm ready to swallow us whole. I couldn't stay still. I had to know what was happening. I shifted slowly, careful not to make a sound, and moved closer to my brother. His face was grim, his jaw clenched tightly. "What do we do now?" I whispered, barely able to form the words. He didn't answer at first. His eyes were far away, as if listening for something I couldn't hear. Then, finally, he spoke. "We wait." My stomach twisted at the word. Wait. We had already been waiting for what felt like forever. I wanted to argue, to tell him that we couldn't just stay here. But something in his eyes told me he was right. We had no choice. The soldiers could be right outside, or they could be miles away. There was no way to know. The air in the hut felt thicker now. The silence, so heavy it pressed against my chest. I glanced at the tiny crack in the wall, the only glimpse of the outside world. The trees stood still, like dark sentinels watching. But there was no movement, no sound. I exhaled slowly, trying to push back the panic rising in my throat. Every minute that passed felt like it dragged us closer to the edge, but I couldn't escape it. My brother was right. We had to wait. Then, suddenly, a sound. A faint crack of a twig snapping in the distance. My body tensed instantly. My brother's head snapped toward the door, his face tightening. He raised his hand, signaling us to stay silent. We froze. The sound came again, this time louder. Footsteps. I could feel my pulse racing in my ears, my breath caught in my throat. Were they here? Were the soldiers outside? My brother's gaze flickered to the crack in the door, his eyes narrowing. The footsteps were unmistakable now. Too close, too real. I could almost hear the sound of rifles being shifted, the soft murmur of voices. My heart dropped. This wasn't a chance. It was an end. I turned to my mother, but her eyes were wide with terror. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came. We were trapped. We had nowhere to run. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and then I heard it, a voice, a shout. It was a voice I knew. The voice called out again, sharp and urgent. It was a voice I recognized, my father's voice. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest, unable to breathe. Impossible. He was gone. I had watched them take him. I had seen them drag him away. I hadn't even been able to say goodbye. But there it was again, louder this time, cutting through the thick silence of the hut. "Come out. We know you're in there." My brother's hand went to the door, his fingers trembling, but he didn't open it. I wanted to scream, to run, to reach for that voice, to believe in it. But deep inside, a part of me knew the truth. This wasn't him. It couldn't be. My brother's eyes were hard, unreadable. As he whispered, "Stay quiet," I nodded, though the words felt like they were stuck in my throat. I could feel my mother beside me, her breath shallow, her hands shaking as she clutched me. The footsteps stopped right outside the hut. The tension in the air was unbearable. And then nothing. Silence. The world seemed to hold its breath. I could hear my own heartbeat, each thud echoing in the quiet. I strained to listen, but there were no more footsteps, no more voices. Had they gone? Were we still safe? I didn't dare move. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. And then, a rustling outside. I jumped, my body jerking instinctively toward my mother. But my brother remained still, his eyes trained on the door. Finally, a low voice spoke, clear, sharp. Move. Now, it was my father's voice again. This time, there was no mistaking it. My brother's eyes flickered to me, and for the first time, I saw something that looked like hope in his face. Without a word, he crept to the door. He eased it open, just a crack. And there, standing in the moonlight, was my father, alive. I couldn't believe my eyes. His face was bruised, his clothes torn, but he was alive. He looked at us, his eyes locking with mine, and a smile tugged at the corners of his lips. "Come on," he whispered, his voice hoarse but full of relief. We didn't hesitate. We stepped into the night, into the unknown, together. For the first time in what felt like forever, we were whole again. We stepped into the night, our footsteps light on the soft earth, as if the world was letting us move forward in silence, granting us a brief reprieve. My father was there, standing before us, his eyes tired but resolute. I wanted to cry out, to throw myself into his arms, but I held back, unsure if this moment was truly real. Could it be? After everything? The soldiers were still out there, I knew that. The danger was far from over. But for the first time in what felt like forever, there was a small, flickering light of hope in my chest. My brother stepped forward first, his eyes wide, disbelieving. "Father?" My father nodded once, his gaze scanning the woods around us before resting back on us. "We don't have much time," he said, his voice low but urgent. We didn't question him. Together we moved, following him through the trees, our pace quickening as we left the shelter of the hut behind. I kept close to my mother, her hand still clutching mine, and her eyes scanning the darkness. Every moment felt like it could be our last. But my father was leading us now, guiding us through the forest as though he knew every tree, every stone, every turn. The path was narrow, and the darkness pressed in, but with each step, I felt the fear begin to loosen its grip on me. We didn't speak, but our movements were synchronized, a silent bond of survival. Eventually, after what felt like an eternity, we reached the edge of the forest. Ahead, there was a clearing. I could see a faint light in the distance, an unfamiliar shape, something that promised safety. My father stopped, turning to us, his face filled with determination. "We're almost there," he said, his voice firm. And in that moment, I realized something deep within me. It didn't matter what the future held, what dangers awaited us in the next step. We had each other, and that was all we needed. I took a deep breath, my chest lifting with a feeling of release. We moved forward, into the unknown, knowing we would face it together. No matter what happened, we had survived this far. And as long as we had each other, we could survive anything.